So if you play blues, one thing that may seem totally scary and off limits to you is playing standards. They're longer, they have more chords, they seem trickier, they're played by jazz musicians. In this lesson, I just want to show you a way to think about standards that makes them less scary. A couple things you can do to look at them in a way that makes them more approachable and something you might ultimately be able to put into your repertoire. Let's go. So standards are typically 32 bars long, and they're built out of 8-bar sections. So one thing you can do as a kind of starting step to learning standards is learn some 8-bar blues. I teach a lot of them in my membership. I've mentioned a lot of them here on the channel. You can go find a lesson that I did called 5 8-bar blues you should know, or something like that. But, you know, songs like Trouble in Mind or Key to the Highway or St. James Infirmary, there are all these songs that are 8 bars long, and it can get you used to thinking in 8-bar sections so that when you come to playing standards, you're like, oh yeah, it's just put together out of 8-bar sections. And that can make it a little less intimidating to look at standards in the first place. But the main thing I want to suggest is to learn how to play these tunes in the key of C. So standards are different from 12-bar blues in that they include some of the funny chords, right? So if you're playing in C, you've got 1, which is C, and 4, which is F, and 5, which is G7. Now, standards have these other chords added in. If you're playing in C, some of the funny chords are going to be E7, A minor, or maybe A7, D minor, or maybe D7, and then things may be done to those chords, like the G chord might no longer be just a G, but it might be a G augmented chord, which could also be called a flat 13 chord. So break it into these two things. You can have these chords that are not 1, 4, and 5, and then there can be things added to them like 9s and flat 13s and stuff like that. But if you know that's the territory, then you can start to look at these things in a way that makes it feel less intimidating. So if you know first, like, oh, it's okay to play these songs in a key like C, like you don't have to play the song in the key it was originally done in. A lot of these tunes were done in keys like F or A flat or B flat. But if you're playing solo guitar, who cares? You can put it in a key like C, and that'll make everything look a lot more familiar. It'll also give you a lot more open chords. And then if you start to look at the kinds of chords you can have in the key besides the 1, 4, and 5, that can make things a little more approachable as well. And then finally, if you can start to understand why some of those things like 9s and 13s are added to the chords and what they're called, they're usually just added to dominant chords, to 7th chords, and they're usually only added when that dominant chord is on its way somewhere else. So there's reasons why those dominant chords are added into the song in the first place, and there's reasons why those extra notes are added on top. And if you can get a handle on that, then it can start to diffuse the whole situation quite a bit. So let's just look at one of these towering standards, right? I played a bit of Georgia on My Mind on the way into this lesson. So if we put Georgia in C, then the A section has a C chord, and an E7 chord, and an A minor chord with this kind of tricky walk down, but it basically ends up on an F chord, and then an F sharp diminished chord. And then it goes through all these very familiar looking chords: C, A7, D7, G, and C. So let's just stop for a second and look at what's going on. If you're in the key of C, you have a C chord. What's this E chord doing here? Well, in the key of C, we also have A minor. That's the relative minor of C. It's the sixth chord. The rule says that for any chord that belongs in the key, you can borrow the chord that would be the 5 chord of that chord if you were in that key at the moment. So if you were in the key of A minor, the 5 chord would be E7. You're not in A minor, you're in the key of C, but A minor belongs in the key of C. So if you have an A minor chord, you are allowed to temporarily borrow this E7, which would be the 5 of A minor if we were in A minor. You can borrow that chord, it's the 5 of A minor. So we get C to E7 to A minor. Now all this other stuff, the melody is just going, which is safe as milk, right? It's just, it's C major pentatonic, but the chords make it sound so tricky. And so what's happening there? We're coming from the A minor. At its simplest, what we're doing is just going back to C. Remember that idea that you can borrow the dominant chord, the 5 chord of a chord that belongs in the key? In this case, we're going to the F chord, and we're saying, oh, we're going to an F chord. What's the 5 of F? Oh, it's C. Well, we can play a C7 chord to get to that F chord, right? That's legit. So even though the 1 chord in the key isn't usually a 7th chord, unless you're playing 12-bar blues, in this case, we can have C7, and it's going to take us to F. So, and it works with the melody. And here I'm going to play basically a C9 chord and put the melody on top of that. And I'm making the melody a little bluesier because that fits with the sound of this C7 chord. That takes me to the F chord. And then the slightly even trickier thing is to say, oh, I'm on my way to F. I'm using C7 to get there. That's the 5 of F. Well, what would be the 2 chord in the key of F? It would be G minor. And so G minor to C to F makes this really nice, strong chord motion called a 2-5-1. Yes, we're going to the 4 chord in the key of C, but we're temporarily thinking of F as the 1. So we have G minor to C to F, and we call that a 2-5-1. And it still works with the melody. There's my G minor 7. Here's my bluesy C9 going to the F. And then I'm going from F to F sharp diminished, and the F sharp diminished is taking me back to C because it is a kind of diminished chord that is called a common tone diminished, meaning it has a chord in common with the chord it has a chord tone, a note, in common with the chord you're on your way to. So like a dominant chord, it's a kind of resolution. F sharp diminished has a C in it. So that diminished chord is resolving to C. And you can float around the internet and find all kinds of stuff about common tone diminished chords and why they work. But basically this F sharp takes us to C because of this common note C that both chords have. And so that's all of this part of the melody. And now we're into the second half of the first 8 bars. Okay, that's an A7. What's that doing there? I'll tell you in just a second. Going then to D7, to G, and we've come back around. Then the melody's done, and we can do whatever we want for the next 2 bars. long as it takes us back to C. Okay, so what are these chords like A7 and D7 and G7 doing here? In order to figure that out, we have to work backwards. So we know that C is okay because C is the 1 chord in the key of C. So we can always have a C. And G, or G7 in this case, is actually the 5 chord in the key of C. So that's okay. But remember, the 5 of C. So G is resolving to C. And then we can go, okay, well, what was that thing about we can always have the 5 chord of a chord that is in the key of C? So we can look at G and go, what's the 5 of G? It's D. So we could have a D7 chord. D7 as the 5 of G would take us to G7, and then G7 as the 5 of C would take us home. And then when we're looking at D7, we go, well, what's the 5 of D? Oh, it's A. Okay, so we could have A7. A7 is the 5 of D7. So that resolves. D7 is the 5 of G7. G7 is the 5 of C. And if you weren't trying to play these chords up the neck to accommodate maybe the melody of a song, all these chords are sitting right here in open position. So they're not that unfamiliar, and they're right where they belong and easy to grab. I mean, these are the chords that you'd play if you were playing like a guitar rag, you know. So they're guitar stuff, and they're in a familiar place because we're playing in the key of C. Now that is all true about these chords resolving the way they do, and there's one wrinkle, especially in this particular tune we're talking about, Georgia on My Mind, which is that the chords do need to match the melody. And so if you're actually playing the melody of the song, you really need a D minor 7 chord, not a D7 chord. And that's okay, because guess what? D minor 7 is in the key of C. It belongs as the 2 chord. So when these things are going on, you can have either a D7 chord, depending on the situation and the song, or you might have D minor 7. But the effect is the same. A7 resolves to D minor 7 just as well as it resolves to D7. And D minor 7 leads to G7 the same way that D7 does. So you might see one of those, you might see the other. And depending on how you play the melody, if you're varying the melody just a little bit, then you might end up playing a D7 chord or a D9 chord in this case instead of a D minor 7 chord. And when people are improvising, they might play a little fast and loose with whether that D chord is a dominant chord or a minor 7 chord. So that's how, if you're playing in C, you can find some familiar territory. There's your 1 chord, there's your E7, taking you to your 6 chord that belongs there, to a C7 chord that's taking you to F, to an F sharp diminished that's taking you back to C, to an A7 chord, when played properly, which is the 5 of D7, which is the 5 of G, which is back to C again. So all the chords have a reason for being there. They're not there to confuse you, although it often seems or feels like it is. But if you put the song in a familiar key and start to look at what the chords are doing there based on just a couple of rules about dominant chords and diatonic chords that are in a key, you can start to understand why the chords are there. And then when you look at the melody, you can realize that the melody is actually not that complicated, and it's usually very much based out of the scale of the key that you're in. Those are all C major notes, and that's what the melody's built out of in this case. So those are just a few ideas for how to cut standards down to size, so that if you want to start putting songs like that into your repertoire, you can have a way to begin approaching them that makes them seem a little less weird and intimidating. And like I said, one of the first and best building blocks for playing standards is learning 8-bar blues. And there are a bunch of them that you can learn inside my membership, the Fingerstyle 5. So if you want to know more about that, check out the link below or the link on screen. And in the meantime, if you've got a question about today's lesson, please leave it for me in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.